Thanks so much, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here. Um, I actually don't live in Chicago anymore. I actually live in Denver, and I'm a horticulturalist here in Denver at the Denver Botanic Gardens. But I still do a lot of teaching for the Chicago Botanic Garden on a lot of the topics that you just mentioned. And today we're going to talk about winter houseplant care and how we can really benefit from shifting our perspective of how we take care of our plants in the summer versus in the winter. So we're going to have a little bit of an overview here. We're going to talk about assessing our space. We'll talk about the basics of lighting and watering. We'll get into grooming and maintenance as well as other considerations. And then we'll have a little section on troubleshooting pests and diseases. And then at the end, if there's any questions, I will have some more than enough time to ask and answer any questions that people might have. So home is where my plants are. I have a ton of house plants at home. I maintain two farms, some display gardens, but the house plants are always going to be my favorite things to come home to. And I hope that's the same for you all. So assessing our space. I think that it's important. I'm sure many of us were probably in a whole room of plant lovers and plant aficionados, so we're probably all pretty aware of, who are our house plants. But if you're not, that's something that's really important to consider. Knowing who, like what plants do we have, what species are they, what varieties are they, can really set us up for success. But beyond that, it will help us kind of assess our home and what we might need in our home or to add to our home to create the great environment that our plants might need. I think it's also important to look at our drafts, our temperature fluctuations, and our lighting. So, do we have natural lighting? Do we need to add in supplemental lighting? Is the room that we put all of our plants in actually a really drafty room? These are the kinds of things that we should be looking at when we're considering adding new plants to our home or creating really habitable environments for our house plants. So we'll talk a little bit about common house plants for low light and easy care. And then, you might be familiar with a lot of these plants already. So this first one is Dracaena. A lot of people know it as corn plant or dragon plant. There are a lot of different varieties. They don't tolerate the cold very well, but they do enjoy, bright east-facing light. It doesn't need to be totally full sun or that bright, bright sun. It can be a little bit of that medium light. So an east-facing window is a good window for that. And then the next one we have, sorry, is our aglaonema. A lot of the plants that I, show today are really common house plants, can be found in a lot of garden centers and stores. And I like them because of their, you know, propensity to tolerate cold and, you know, low light environments, but also because a lot of these plants are easily propagatable. They come in a variety of colors. So even if you have one aglaonema, there's probably four others that you don't have that are also equally easy to take care of and, vibrant in their, coloration. This one is a drought tolerant plant. It can handle poor lighting, but dry air does have a little effect on this plant. So you'll see maybe some brown tips if you're, not as humid of an environment for your plants. And even though they can tolerate poor lighting, this is a very bright aglaonema. So if you start noticing that the new growth on your plant isn't as bright or as colorful, that could be an indication that it needs just a little bit more sun. This is called a revert. They're reverting back to their green because green has the most capability of absorbing the nutrients that it needs versus these other colors. Calatheas, these are also known as prayer plants. They'll shed their leaves and go dormant. So if you have one of these plants at home and it looks like maybe it's on its last leg and it's only got like two or three leaves on it, don't lose hope. It could just be that it's going dormant for a little bit of time. And it's really a very communicative plant. There are some plants that we have in our homes, house plants in particular, that are not as it's not easily determined that they need water. They might go a long time before they show signs of stress, whereas calathea are a little bit more dramatic. So they'll curl their leaves, which is not to be confused with when they are first growing new leaves. Those new leaves will kind of look like a tube that will unfurl. But if they're too dry, the older leaves on the outside will start curling in on themselves, and they'll also sort of get that like, brown edging, which is twofold. It needs a little bit more water, and it might be needing a little bit more humidity. This next one you might all be familiar with. This is like the tried and true house plant in my mind. I love it because it's one of those super easy propagated plants. This is pothos. Some people might mistake these for philodendrons, which we'll also talk about, but pothos are really great. They're low light tolerant. They're really forgiving about watering, excuse me, and they come in a variety of colors. So they have variegated ones. They're like one that I really like is called the Snow Queen, which is really, really light, like almost white leaves, and then some like dark green mottling. And these are super easy to propagate. And again, very forgiving in their, watering. If you don't water them as much as some of the other plants, they'll be okay. This next one is alocasia. Some folks put this plant outside in the summertime. Elephant ears is what a lot of people know this common name as. But alocasias come in all shapes and sizes. And inside a home, they're really tolerant to low light as well. And they don't need a lot of water, especially in the winter time. Many plants are going to reduce their watering needs in the winter time, but this one's a really great one. And this one's also one that may, not always, but sometimes will shed all of its leaves and die back to its corm or its like, root system before popping out new plants because it also sometimes goes dormant in particular conditions. And then aloe vera. This is a fun one. I think that we sometimes, consider a lot of cactuses and succulents to be like super high light plants and they can't have any darkness. But aloe, depending on the species, there are some species like aloe blizzard, and some of those more like highly colorful ones that will need a little bit of extra light. But this aloe vera, your straight species, it can go without water for months. And in the winter time, a lot of cactuses and succulents will bloom. So if we like create the right conditions for these plants, we can also have some really beautiful flowers in our home in the winter time. Um, but aloe vera is a really fun one for me as well. And this one, it's twofold. It's not only is it a really nice houseplant, but if you are, of the mindset of like more natural remedies or just, more into natural ways of living, this is a great plant because it's really great for, adding to your foods and to use as like first aid for sunburn or for moisturizing. So it's a round house plant, in my opinion. And then Sansevieria. People know this as mother-in-law's tongue. They know it as snake's tongue. This plant is another really wild one. Just as a quick aside, I grew up in Florida where a lot of these plants that we're looking at are just sort of like naturally occurring. Sansevieria in particular is actually an invasive species in Florida on the dunes. It over and encroaches upon the mangroves and that sort of secondary dune system between the beach and the actual dunes. So this is actually a pretty bad plant in the places that I grew up, but it's a lovely house plant. It likes to be super tight and close to one another. So this isn't one of those plants that you like repot regularly. It's one of those ones that will sit in the same pot for a long, long time. And they are also easily propagated. There's a few different techniques to propagating these and a few different styles of Sansevieria. My favorite is called Moon Glow. It's this like very almost mint green, sort of light colored, solid, instead of like the stripes that we see here in this photo. And then they have this beautiful dark green sort of outlining around the edges of the plant. And, another one is whale tail. So some of them are like long and tall and skinny, but others of them are quite wide in their leaf shape. So it's a unique one and very easy to care for. And then this is philodendron. So philodendrons, they come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. And I've said that about a lot of plants, but what I mean about this one in particular is that the one that is in this photo right here, this is Philodendron Brazil. It's a variety of trailing philodendron. And the biggest difference between a philodendron and a pothos is the leaf shape. And you're probably thinking, Julia, well, maybe not. I'm not going to assume. But some folks might say, there's no difference. How do you see the difference? The difference is with a philodendron, there's a very deep indentation at the top of the plant that when it's connected to the stem of the leaf, and it sort of makes this heart shape. And that's really the distinct difference. And then also the way that the plant unfurls. So philodendrons will have some segments between each leaf, whereas pothos, the new leaf will grow from the edge of the old leaf, if that makes sense. But the other difference between philodendron too is that this is a trailing one, but there are philodendrons that are not trailing and that they look a little bit more like monsteras or alocasias, but they are also philodendrons. So that's why it's really important to know your plants because you might have a philodendron that's not a trailing philodendron. It's actually, more of an upright, shrubby type, and that might need a little bit more water, a little bit more support, or a little bit more light. So I think these are really cool. Little water, does need a ton, super fun to propagate and indirect sunlight will be just fine on this plant. And it doesn't often lose as much of its variegations if it has variegations in that indirect sunlight. So that makes it a really fun plant as well. All right. And I think before we sort of end on talking about the plants that, we might suggest, I just want to kind of touch back on the assessment. So even if you don't have natural light or a sunroom or this like perfect space for your plant. That's okay. We can create the space for our plants. Some of us might not want to. We might just want some of those more easy to care for, just bring a little greenery into my home. I don't want to have to think too much about it. That's why I share these plants because I think these are all really easy to care for and start off with or add to your collection without like overwhelming you into learning a bunch of new skill sets to care for a plant so that it lives a long time. Um, but now we'll get into the lighting and watering. And this is particular in regards to winter time. I know that it doesn't seem like it some days, but we are so close to spring and these considerations will shift a little bit. But I think, putting it into your brain now will really help you for next year, next winter when we start getting into that season again. But we're kind of on the tail end. So some of these things might not totally be applicable to where we're at right now. Um, I also just want to share that even though I've been a horticulturalist for the last 15 years and I've worked in a variety of settings and with a variety of plants, I have definitely killed a few, so you're in good hands. And also, winter is an important time for us. It might not feel like it might feel really hard to be just dealing with the cold and the dark. But we wouldn't know what beauty was if we didn't have this darkness. So as Thomas Wentworth Higginson said, how many lessons of faith and beauty should we lose if there were no winter in our year? But I think these houseplants can give us that little bit of boost, the morale that we need so that we don't lose that. All right. So watering. Watering is probably the most important part about caring for your houseplants regardless of the season. I think we all love our plants a lot, and sometimes that results in overwatering our plants. And in the wintertime, that's actually super detrimental to our plants because A, they're not taking up as much water, they're not taking in as much sunlight, they're not taking in as much nutrients. They're really kind of slowing down and really de-escalating their energy usage. So when we water the same way we water in the summer, those plants could potentially experience soil rot, like root rot, crown rot, wet soil that can be really awesome for gnats or other pests and diseases. So um, in the winter in particular, we just want to reduce our watering frequency. And I think that investing in a hydrometer or a soil moisture meter can really help with us with that in the winter. It's not cheating. I like the old-fashioned way. I stick my hand in the soil. I go a few inches down. I feel how wet it is, just below. And if it is still saturated, I let those plants sort of drink up the rest of the water before I water it again. So this is some examples of a moisture meter. And then on the right side, there's just like a little um, hydrometer, which goes into the soil, and then a moisture meter, which kind of stays on the outside of your soil. And that kind of helps you understand the ambient humidity, the temperature. Some of them have like little indicators like a smiley face or a sad face to show you that like it's too humid or it's not humid enough. And so that can be a helpful tool for you to get your plants super happy in the winter time. Um, some examples of overwatering are, especially with like succulents, those leaves will sort of get really like fleshy and gooey and yellow and soft. You might even smell certain smells just like kind of rotting. You might see like a buildup of mycelium or mold on the top of the soil. That means that your soil is too wet, or your leaves will just sort of droop and be yellow. They won't really be brown unless you let it go, and then just stop watering your plants. So these are some indicators that you're overwatering, but it doesn't mean that your plants not going to live. You can come back from this. So, take off the dead stuff. Check the soil if the soil's super wet. I like to let it dry out for a bit. If that's not the case, you let it dry out for a couple days. Take the plant out of the soil, look at the roots. Are the roots white? Are they thick? Or are they like brown? Does it have a really nasty kind of like rotten egg smell? If it's the first, so it's nice and healthy and the roots are all white, just plop the plant back in the soil, add a little bit of new fresh soil, and then just kind of monitor your watering. If the roots are brown and soggy and it smells bad, it could be that your plant is long gone, but you might be able to save it if you clean off all of the soil and you clean off all the dead roots and then you repot it. With just a little bit of wet water. I generally pre-moisten my soil before I pot up a plant. So just adding the slightest bit of moisture and then kind of monitoring your plant that way can help you. And then, as I mentioned before, if you're noticing gnats around or like those little small flying bugs around your plants, and you're like, what is this? Those are what I call a secondary indicator pest. So they're not necessarily detrimental to your plant, but they are showing you that your soil is super wet and super amazing for them to breed in. And that can lead to, things like root rot or crown rot or things like that, which, we don't want for our plants. So if you see any of these signs, check your root system, check your soil, and, you can always repot and try to mitigate that. Um, I generally, in the winter time too, like to use, warm or tepid water because it won't shock the plant as much. I also generally like to use rainwater or water that's filtered because it's more helpful for the plants. A lot of our water has, some chemicals and minerals in them that while are not terribly harmful, can cause some stress for our plants. There are some plants that just like if you give them tap water, you're killing them. I'm thinking more particularly like carnivorous plants. They're just very sensitive. So instead of risking it or testing the theory out, I just try to do that in general. And if you don't have a filtered system or you don't have the, patience or you don't even want to deal with like rainwater, you can do tap water and just like let it sit out for a little bit before you water your plants. And what that tends to do is like all of the heavy minerals will kind of sink to the bottom. And then you'll be able to just use the top half of the water and then leave that like last little bit, um, pour it out or something. But don't water your plants with it. So that's what I like to do. I think one other thing I'd like to mention about, overwatering, um, is that I like to do what we call a deep soak. So, and I'll touch on this a little bit later, but instead of watering my plants once a week, just a little bit every, couple of days, I will water my plant entirely, soak it so that the water runs through the base of the plant into the saucer, the plant saucer at the bottom. And then once that water kind of runs out, let it sit, not for very long, maybe like an hour, and that will help you with um, mitigating overwatering your plants because then you've fully saturated it and then you can set it and forget it for a little bit of time unless it's a heavy drinker, which we do have some of those. And even when you do a deep soak like that, you're still going to have to water them pretty regularly. So overwatering. Then there's the underwatering. And I'll tell you all that I am a perpetual underwaterer. And I have a very like strict rule of my house, which is like if you can't handle my watering, then you're not cut out to live in this house with me. So um, I have learned the hard way, and I do a lot of research before I bring home a new plant to make sure that my negligence is not going to be the end of a plant. But some plants will bounce back, right? So um, there are some other indicators. These plants will also wilt, but whereas overwatering gives us like these yellow sort of mushy leaves because what's happening is there's like too much water in this plant cells that they burst, right? Whereas with over underwatering, the plant cells are dehydrated and so they'll keep their color, but they'll kind of go limp, they'll lose their structure, their turgidity. And so what you would do is you would try to notice that before it got too bad and then water that plant. You might see like crispy brown edges, that like wilting. And, you know, while I say this, you can come back, right? This is if you water your plant, if you notice that and then you give it a nice deep soak, it'll come back and it'll be happy. I have like a peace lily that does it all the time. She's super dramatic, but it can actually cause way more stress than is necessary. And what will happen is plants, and this happens a lot of times in, outside in the farm world for me, our plants will hit a level of stress that they can no longer come back from. And so they'll actually start declining because even if you keep giving it water, it's already, sucked the whole life out of it. And now it's just this like empty husk that you're trying to feed water to. So you know, and that can happen for a variety of reasons, but generally it's because you're underwatering. So just don't do too much. And then, I think watering is super important because it's the life of the plant, right? That's how these plants live. And when we cultivate a relationship with our plants, when we're looking at our plants every day, touching the soil, looking at the leaves, we can really start to see and understand what our plants need, right? A lot of these houseplants are tropical natives that we're now putting into our homes, which we blast the heat on in the wintertime, create these super dry, hot environments. And these plants are like, I don't know how to live like this. What do I do? And so when we get to know our plants and we get to know what their needs are, we're giving them their best chance. And subsequently, it makes us happy, right? So, um, that's a little bit about watering. And I'll also say this too, right? I think that as a horticulturalist, as somebody who's worked in greenhouses and on farms, people are always like, well, what's the watering schedule? Like, how do you water your plants? And someone like every 3 days, every day. It's different. Each plant is different. So even if you have a watering schedule and you're like, I water all of my plants on Monday and then I water them all again on Friday or all again on Thursday or something, um, there might be some plants who just like need a little bit of extra water, or some of those plants are like, I could actually use a little bit less. So I think it's good to look at this on an individual level. So all that to say, lighting. This is also really important for our plants, and especially in the winter time. Um, there's never been a house that I've lived in, unfortunately, where I haven't had to use supplemental lighting in the winter time. That's just not a luxury that I've had. So, um, you know, you'll want to just kind of check in with that. What is the natural light in your home? What are the windows? Where are the windows facing? Do you have a lot of south facing windows? Do you have a lot of north facing windows? What is around your house? Do you have big trees? Do you have apartment buildings? Do you have, anything blocking and awning? These are all factors that will contribute to the what we call the light index or the ambient light in our home. And so with that, you'll look at all of your windows and you'll notice, okay, I have a south facing window, and in the wintertime, this room is so bright. It's kind of ridiculous how hot it gets and how bright it is. But in the summertime, it's the sun is so high up and at an angle that it's actually way less sun in my room or in this room. So, I like to take notes. I um, move a lot, so every house is a new experience for me. Um, but if you can stay, if you're in a home for, that's your home and you're not leaving, get a notebook, do some observations, see like, okay, in from September until May, this room only gets, 4 hours of light and it's direct and it's this way. Or, this room gets really great light at this time of day, but then in the afternoon it's not. And I'm kind of, going all over the place here, but what I'm trying to instill is that natural light changes during the seasons. That's just it just happens. So even if you have this really great room and light is perfect in the summertime, it might not be perfect in the wintertime, and you might not have another option. So adding that extra supplemental lighting is going to be great. Um, but I think doing some observations, some just quick paying attention to what the sun looks like in various rooms will really help you. So kind of touched on this a little bit, but in the wintertime, your south facing windows are going to be a little bit more, the sun's going to be lower, so it'll be more direct light. If you have plants on the floor, those plants are going to get less light. If you have hanging plants or plants in your windowsill, those plants are going to get really great light. West facing is considered like this bright medium light. It can support highlight plants, but windowsills can give us drafts. So if you have sensitive plants to cold, this might not be a great window. You might need to put some protection up. And with the west facing in the summer or the winter time, that's the most harshest sun of the day. So I move my plants around the house, depending on the seasons. And I also add the supplemental lighting. But with that, considering that if you move a plant that's been in one spot for a long time into another spot that's more sun or more intense sun, you can actually cause that plant to have sunburn or sun scalding. They might drop their leaves, they might just burn. Like we get sunburn when we go out to the sun and don't put sunscreen on. If we just like shove a plant into a space that's brand new to them that they haven't had that exposure to, that can also cause some stress. So what I like to do is rotate my plants in the windowsills that they're in so they start getting that even light. And then when I'm, okay, it's getting to be September, October, the light's changing, I'm gonna move the plants into another room. I do it sort of gradually. Whereas like they'll go from one windowsill to kind of like near another windowsill, but not directly in it, and then, kind of shifting it. Similarly, if you take plants, if you're a gardener and you have seeds that you started for your vegetable garden or something, and then you want to put those outside, you do a hardening, right? So you bring them outside for a little bit, expose them to the sun, the winds, elements, and then protect them a little bit more. So it's kind of the same concept. North facing, no matter what situation you're in, is generally just not a great option for light. But in some cases, I've had really interesting experiences where, my north facing window wouldn't really get a whole lot of light to begin with, but the house next to it was this super bright wall. And so then the south facing sun reflects on this bright white wall. And then that creates this really bright light in my north facing window, which is comparable to an east facing light. So it's there's no hard and fast, and each house is going to be super unique and super different for like what you can accomplish just naturally and what you might have to add to really supplement your success. Um, and then lastly, there's these east facing windows, right? And that's that more gentle, soft light, the morning light. It's kind of considered like dappled in some degree, but it can support plants that have more of that like medium light need. And then if you put it in the windowsill specifically, it can be considered a more highlight, but it's not going to be for a long period of time. So you just want to consider that. This is a light meter, a light index. It can show you how much light you have, ambient light from a particular space. So this is really helpful for design, right? Sometimes I'll be asked to go into a home and figure out like where can we put plants and how it'll look nice. It's not just like I want a pretty plant. It's like this is an aesthetic. We're staging a home or something like that. So we'll use a light index meter and kind of go from the window away and how far away can we go from the window and still successfully care for a plant without having to add like clunky lighting. There's tons of seamless, aesthetically pleasing lighting that people create all the time for homes. But, you know, I'm not, I'm personally more on the side of like the less is more, and I'll just use the Amazon lights and call it a day. But yeah, some other things to consider. We talked about this, right? The sun's angle and decreased warmth. It's going to give us more access to light in some regard, but it might actually cause this stress to our leaves. So we just want to be considerate of that. Um, Mirrors and snow. So I talk a lot about ambient light and natural light. There's also something called reflected light, and we can really play with our home's natural ambient light in reflected light. So with mirrors in particular, you can take a window or take a room and add mirrors to the opposite side of the window so that the light coming in from the window reflects off that mirror and creates a more brighter situation for you. Same thing goes with like white colors or light colored walls. This will increase the ambient light in your room. And if you get like really high snowpack or, there's just a lot of snow on the ground, that always is going to create brighter conditions for your home. So opening up the windows, letting all that light in can really help your plants. But if you don't have those available to you, or you're noticing that even with all of those efforts, you're still seeing your plants maybe not growing to your liking or even like growing just happily, you might need some supplemental lighting. So when we're looking at supplemental lighting, there's a lot of things to consider. The quality of light, the duration of how long you're going to have these lights on, and aesthetic. It's important to people. So I always try to bring that in there. But there are a couple different kinds of colored lights, right? So you have your LED full spectrum lights. This is going to have all the wavelengths in them. Helpful for general lighting. But let's say you have orchids or you have cactuses or African violets or anything that flowers, Christmas cactuses, so on and so forth. You might want to consider getting a light that has the blue and red lights in them, as well as also the full spectrum light. That's going to help your plants with their blooming process. And then depending on how long your lights are going to be on. Do you have, 6 hours of direct sun and then you just need an extra 2 hours? Or does this room have no light at all and it's going to need to be on for 12 hours? You might want to get some of those more like energy efficient lights versus like a just a regular like um, light fixture. So this example right here, these are just regular bulbs. This is a interesting design concept for growing plants in your home, but a lamp can work too. You don't need to go out and buy like these huge contraptions or, spend a lot of money on lights. There's a lot of really inexpensive um, lights out there. And then yeah, the intensity. So in a lot of lights, you can kind of adjust how bright that light is. That's really going to be dependent again on what your plant's needs are. So I've had great success with growing plants using a lot of different Amazon products. You can go to there's tons of different garden centers, Gethsemane and the like, and they have tons of different lighting options for you. Um, I generally like the clip-ons with the snake kind of um, attachments because then I can sort of move them however I want and configure my plants in different ways for them to be happy. So I don't generally like promote any brands or recommend any brands because they're going to be based on what your needs and costs that you can afford are. But Amazon has tons of them. I just generally recommend based on what you're growing. You might either want just a plain full spectrum, which has all the lightweight lengths, or you would get the red and the blue for more of the flowering plants. All right. Well, now we're going to get into the grooming and maintenance, which a lot of these that I talk about here are stuff that you can use throughout the entirety of your practices seasonally. Doesn't need to change, but it's really important, I think, in the winter to consider some of these. So that daily care, that cultivation of your relationship with your plants, you're going to be checking your plants, looking at them daily. This means looking at the tops of the leaves, the underside of the leaves. This helps you check for those pests and diseases that you might not notice. Wiping off the dust of the leaves is really important. We have pores and plants have pores. They're called stomas tomatas and they get clogged. And if we have the heat on or we're not opening the windows because it's cold, there can be a good bit of dust buildup that, gathers on our plants. So there are like mitts that you can use. You can just get a microfiber rag. You can just use your hand, whatever works for you. But wiping the dust off the leaves is really going to help your plants. I generally prune all dead and dying material off my plants, just less energy going to it, more energy going to the rest of the plants, and then it, halts the potential buildup of any diseases or issues with the plant. And then we talked about this a little bit when we were talking about lighting, but rotating those plants for optimal light exposure. Maybe some of you have noticed this in your home, right? You have a plant in a window and it's been in that window forever and it's kind of just like leaning all in this one direction, and then the side that's not on the exposed to the window is like not as luscious or not as fully grown. That's because it's not getting the sun that it needs. So I like to rotate just about a quarter turn every few days, every week, and that both twofold stops your plant from feeling super stressed out from being just like flipped around completely. And it promotes that sort of even, full growth. And then keeping the humidity up. I think in the winter time, especially, it's important to keep the humidity up. And there's a lot of ways that we can do that. Um, so this is a method of cleaning that I like to employ in the winter time in particular. It's called clean and steam. So I have a lot of houseplants, probably over 100, and it takes a lot of time to care for them. So this might not be something that you want to do regularly, but what I like to do is about once a month in the winter time, I will go through all of my plants and I'll take them in, groups and bring them into the bathroom, and I will use generally like an organic soap. So I use Dr. Bronner's and water, and I'll wash the leaves and I'll turn the water on to like a nice warm water, and I'll let the steam kind of build up, and then I'll rinse the plant off and I'll give it a nice deep soak. And that helps me twofold. That gets rid of the dust. That helps me see if there's any pests or diseases. If I do notice any pests or issues on my plants before I bring them into the room with all these other plants, or, cross-contaminate plants by bringing this plant into another room, I will wash it, soap and water, and then I'll use, I have a variety of insecticides and pesticides that I use, generally organic. I have some DIY ones that I use as well. Talk about that in a little bit, but I'll wash it off first, and then I'll do the steam and clean. And then it goes into another room, which we'll also talk about later. It's called um, isolation and recovery. But this is really helpful because it kind of promotes that humidity. You get a nice deep soak for your plant. You can really clean everything well, and then it's just kind of gives it a nice little spa day. And, you can also just have your plants in your bathroom, which is really nice as well. Humidity is important. Um, Pretty much all the time. Again, most of these houseplants are tropical for the most part, unless you have some cactuses. And even then, there are some cactuses that really like humidity, like the Christmas cactus plant, for instance. So you can group your plants close together. They transpire. When they transpire and respirate, they're releasing oxygen, but they're also releasing some water molecules. So that will create humidity for you. But the downside of that is if you have a lot of plants and one of the plants has bugs or something, and you're putting all those plants close together, there's a chance that the bugs from that plant can spread to your other plants. So before you start grouping your plants together, you just want to look at them all, make sure everybody's happy and healthy, pest free, and then you can kind of group them together. But you can also invest in humidifiers. There's really inexpensive ones. There's really, really big ones. Again, going to be kind of what's going to be beneficial for your home. I've used both, excuse me, and I find success with all of them. No amount of humidity is too much, I think, in our homes, really. But you can there's like these radiator hangers, which are like these cups that you can fill water with. And so when your radiators, you know, heating up the house, it'll kind of warm up the water in there and create steam. Or a tried and true method is just adding pebbles to the bottom of your plant saucer, and then that will be able to just upkeep humidity for you and keep your plant from being sitting in water, which we don't want because then we can, again, create that root rot. So those are just a couple of tips and tricks for creating humidity, cleaning your plants, and then we'll get into some considerations, right? So if you do this already, you might want to halt on fertilizer, any other added nutrients that you're putting into your plants. They're, slowing down for the winter time, so they're not really going to need a ton of inputs. Um, Again, drafts are really, really important. If you're noticing that some of your plants that were really happy in the summer are now like dropping leaves pretty rapidly, and you can't really see, it's not because you're underwatering or overwatering. Maybe it's because of some drafts and cold temperatures. So consider that. Oops, so sorry. You'll also maybe want to move your plants around. We talked about that a lot, rotating your plants around the house. And then I briefly touched on this, but most plants really enjoy temperatures between 55 and 70. So like 55 at night, 70 during the day. I don't know who's keeping their house at 70 during the day in the summertime, or in the winter really, but that's kind of where they like to be. But with cactuses and succulents, if you want them to bloom and create those really luscious, gorgeous, sort of trailing plants, you'll want to sort of reduce the temperature. So I have a ton of cactuses living in Denver. It's way easier to care for cactuses in this dry weather. So what I like to do is I take all of my cactuses and they go into our coldest room in the house, which is in the front of the house, and put them in, give them extra light, and they sit in that cold room, and we get blooms sometimes in December, sometimes in January, and then by like February, March, they sort of trail off. So if you want to have some blooming cactuses. You might want to just consider lowering your temperature and moving those plants into a colder room. So, and then we talked a little bit about um, the weather, what they like. 50 degrees is nice, but anything lower than that is bad. And then also another thing to consider, you have your plants against the window. It's important, like if it's cold outside and your plants are sitting, their leaves are sitting on the window itself, they can actually get frozen. They can freeze because that transference of temperature. And so that's actually happened to one of my monsteras in the front of the house. It's an east-facing window. We got really cold weather. There was one leaf that was just really pressed against the window and it froze. So, if you know that there's going to be some cold weather, maybe just kind of push your plants a little bit farther away from the windowsill or just make sure nothing's touching the windowsill because that can really affect them as well. A heat mat could be helpful, especially in those draftier areas, but you will want to check the soil more because if you have underheat kind of warming those plants up, it can really dry out the soil a lot quicker. So you just want to check in on that pretty regularly. And then flowering may halt or begin. We talked about that a little bit, but flowering is twofold with cactuses and succulents. It's very much seasonally. Some other plants, when they start to flower, that actually means that they're kind of ending their life and they're ready to kind of put out their progeny and end. So if it's not something like an orchid or an African violet, I'm thinking more particularly like sansevierias. When they start to bloom, those snake plants, when they start to bloom, that actually means that they're dying. Um, if you notice that your plants are getting super leggy or they're kind of angling in one direction, that's indicative of needing more light. That's called phototropism, following the light. We talked about two variegated plants. They might revert back to like just a solid green because they're lacking sun. So you can always ameliorate that by adding supplemental light. And then winter would not be winter if we didn't force a few bulbs indoors to create some color and scent in our home with things like amaryllis or narcissus. Um, and this is just kind of some reiterations here, but some plants will go dormant in the winter, losing all of their leaves or halting all their growth altogether, like the calathea, marantas. Those plants are going to probably drop all of their leaves and look like nothing's even there. And then you have some plants that are kind of semi-dormant where they'll need a little bit of water. But most cactuses and succulents, I just stop watering altogether between November and March. And by like mid-March, I'll start kind of just barely watering them. So I just stop fussing with my plants in the winter. I don't repot them. Even if I'm like, oh, this plant could really, really use a repotting, I wait until spring because it's just going to set them up for so much more success. Just thinking about plant growth in general, in the summertime, they're really sending all of their energy up into their leaves, growing, fruiting, flowering. In the wintertime, they're going back down into the ground. It's all underground in their root system. So we just really don't want to do a ton of stuff to kind of mess that up for them while they're growing. So I just don't really do a whole lot. Then here are some examples of paper whites and amaryllis. They're just so fun. I generally start these a little bit sooner, usually around December, January, but you can do it with hyacinths, especially right now as we getting into springtime. And then I know we just have a little bit of time left, so we'll kind of breeze through this troubleshooting of pests and diseases. And some common pests that we have in our home are mites, aphids, scale, whitefly, mealybugs, fungus, gnats, and thrips. And in regards to all of these, it happens. We get bugs. If you have your windows open, bugs will come in. If you garden outside, bugs are going to come in. If you just buy plants from the garden centers, sometimes bugs come in that way. So you just always want to check yourself. Don't kind of like if you have one plant that definitely has bugs on it, don't go from that plant and like start touching other plants. Just kind of really wash your hands, wash any tools that you have. And I always like to do like prescriptive drenches. So like whenever I get a new plant, before I integrate it into a home, into my like general uh designs of the house, I'll uh use like a bug spray on them and kind of leave them in a room by themselves, isolated from any other plants, and just monitor them for a little bit. But I'm sorry if these photos are, unnerving to some people, but up in the left-hand corner is scale. These are a hard-bodied insect. They are brown, black, red. They generally like to congregate on the undersides of leaves and at the stems, and generally around new growth. Um, with some like cactuses and succulents, they'll kind of go inside those little segments, so they might be harder to see. They generally do well with like an alcohol spray, soap and water, and with scale and to the right of them, mealybug. The most effective way to get rid of these bugs is through painstaking manual removal. So I will take Q-tips dipped in alcohol and, excuse me, kind of slide them off, and then have a cup that I dip the Q-tip into, before, repeating that process. Because both of these bugs are very difficult to get rid of. It really it bears to be repeated that like you probably will have to do these applications a few times and monitor your plants pretty regularly, especially if you do know that you have bugs. For example, I have a Schefflera plant that was inherited, and I didn't notice any bugs when I inherited it, so I brought it into the rest of the house, and then slowly but surely it got scale, and it still has it, and it's probably like something that I'm gonna have to deal with for a long time. Um, because because I don't like to use chemicals that are like not natural or organic. So there are things that you can use, like a soil drench, which is a little bit more hardcore. I'll say it's just, it's chemicals, and that will go into the soil, and then the roots will take it up. And then when the bugs eat the plant material, they'll actually ingest that chemical and die. And it's, this is personal preference. My personal preference is organic methods. So I use a lot of soap and water, Dawn dish soap, Dr. Bronner's. I use like cayenne pepper and peroxide, alcohol, neem oil, um, and just manual removal. Sometimes it's taking the whole plant and just like putting it outside and saying, "You're not, we're done," and there's like that motion of like, do I give up on this plant or do I keep going? And that's really dependent on you. So down here at the bottom on the left side is aphids. Aphids are pretty common as well. Their exoskeletons of their larvae, their nymph stage, will oftentimes look like whitefly. So you might misdiagnose the plant with whitefly when it's actually aphids. These are a soft-bodied insect, so they generally do well with like an alcohol spray, soap and water, neem oil. That will all stop them. They're a sucking insect, so they also are just going to kind of eat away at the plant. Um, and they congregate at the bottoms and on the new growth as well. And then this one on the bottom right is mites, and they're really difficult to see. They're super tiny, but you might notice them a little bit too late because you'll start seeing these thick webs, usually on the underneath of the plant. You might notice it sooner because what happens with mites is they sort of make the plant look like it's I've lost the word, but the chlorophyll, it's lacking chlorophyll, so it's almost desiccated looking. It's sort of like the bright green around the veins is all that you see, and everything else is sort of yellow or really crunchy. Mites usually show up when the conditions are really dry. And then here we have up at the top is whitefly. Down below, underneath that is thrips. And then to the right is mealybug again. And so all of these insects are pretty common, especially in greenhouses where a lot of our tropical plants are grown. So again, really important to just sort of look at your plants up, down, all around before you buy a new plant, before you bring a new plant in your home, and just the plants you already have in your home. All right. And then common diseases. So diseases are a little bit hard to diagnose because some of them overlap. But some of the more common ones are things like crown rot and root rot, which we talked about, as well as powdery mildew. These are all things that are really going to happen if you're overwatering your plants. Crown rot's going to be right at the base of your plant where the stem and the soil meet. And then root rot's going to be underneath the soil. Both are going to kind of cause either your plant to completely like fall over and die, if it's crown rot in particular, a lot harder to come back from unless you do something like an air layering or propagating with crown rot. But with root rot, you can come back from that, right? We talked about that a lot with just sort of taking away the soil, monitoring the roots, reducing our watering. Leaf spots, cold damage, leaf drop, and wilt are really, really hard to determine what's the cause of it. It could be because of cold drafts. It could be because of a bug. It could be because of lack of nutrients. It could be because of underwatering. So it's sometimes really hard to determine those latter few. But if you're noticing a lot of leaf drop, or just like super brown leaves immediately, it could be that it's cold in your home or there's a draft that your plants are exposed to. If it's wilt or leaf spots, it could be that you're underwatering your plant, you're overwatering your plant, or it's lacking particular nutrients. So up at the top, we have leaf spot. This is because of the application of a pesticide on the plant that then was exposed to harsh sun. So it pooled in these spots and then the sun kind of burnt it. So that's where this leaf spot is coming from. But leaf spot could also be because of bugs, or it could be because of cold damage. So it's really hard to tell sometimes. Powdery mildew, however, it's a lot more common in outdoor plants. And once you have it in an outdoor plant, it's kind of hard to get rid of. But powdery mildew happens because of overwatering and like watering improperly. So you're watering all the leaves and you're like spraying them or misting them pretty regularly instead of just watering the soil or deeply watering around the base of the plant instead. So powdery mildew out of like all of these diseases is probably the easiest to avoid. And then we talked about root rot already, so I won't go into that anymore. And then we talked about wilt leaf and or wilting and leaf drop. So this really can be caused by a number of factors. But generally speaking, especially in the winter time, it could be because it's cold. It could also be because the plants just generally are, going dormant and they're dropping their leaves because they don't need to grow right now. And we're done with the lecture part. I just wanted to show you a few photos. This was my old house in Chicago, and it's behind, oops, so sorry, the window with the blue was a west-facing window, and the window that's all greenery, that was a south-facing window. So this room got a lot of really bright, hot light, and the plants that we primarily chose to grow in here were all like cactuses and succulents, with a few exceptions of like some philodendrons and some calatheas. But primarily it was all um, succulents. And then we still had to, even with south and west facing windows in the winter time, we still had to add a ton of supplemental lighting. So, it happens. And then this room was east facing, and we had to use supplemental lighting. These lights that are hanging are called Black Magic. I do like them. I use them for seed starting, and I also use them for supplemental lighting in the winter time. So they're super great. And you might not be able to see it, but there's also in the bottom right-hand corner, there is a humidifier there that was like a 4-gallon humidifier. And that's how we were able to keep our ferns alive. And so that was it. I'm happy to answer any questions you all might have now, but I am gonna just stop sharing my screen. I'm sorry, I can't hear anything. No. No.
There we go.
Yeah, there we go.
Oh,
Okay.
the question is about African violets. She
Uh-huh.
had some that she got, and they have started clumping up almost like several plants real close to each other. Is that the? They look like separate plants. Any advice?
Well, is there a concern that they're all too close together, or are you like trying to separate them out to create new plants? Because that's just the normal habit growth of them, and they're fine to stay like that.
Okay, great. Super. So she's happy to leave them like that.
Okay.
Any other questions? How diluted do you use the Dr. Bromers?
I just do like a few drops into a spray bottle, and then mix the rest of it with water. So not a ton, if I'm doing like a spray. If I'm doing like the clean and steam and I am gonna like use a sponge to wipe the plants down, I just do a few drops directly onto the sponge so that it gets nice and like bubbly, and then wipe the leaves that way.
Yeah, how do you deal with fungus gnats?
Yeah, so there's this really great tool that was developed that are like those yellow sticky traps. I use that to just get rid of the fungus gnats, and then, I alter my watering. I check the soil, reduce the watering if it looks like the soil's really moist. And then if you're worried that there might be some, larva or fungus gnats in the soil itself, you can do like a nice Dr. Bronner's soak. So just like again, a few drops of soap into your watering can and then water your plant. Dr. Bronner's is like you can use it for anything and you don't need to use a lot of it.
Any other questions? Yes. Is it okay if the Dr. Bronner's gets in the soil? It sounds like it is.
Yeah, yeah, totally. You want it, it's going to go all the way through the soil. Same thing with like the clean and steam after you've watered, you've wiped your leaves down and you've watered your plants, that all that soap is going to drain into the soil and it's totally fine. That's why I generally use the Dr. Bronner's, but like Dawn dish soap is going to be okay too. The only caveat I give, right, is if you're going to do this with like a carnivorous plant or one of the more sensitive plants, they just generally don't like their soil to be messed with. So if that's, don't do it. But if it's any other plant, it's totally fine.
Are you using it like a systemic?
Yeah, so you drench the soil. Yep.
Okay. Sounds like that's about it. Thank you very much, Julie.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you all so much. Super appreciated sharing everything with you. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of your winter.
We will try. Okay, thanks again, and we'll see you
Bye.
later.
Bye-bye.